When it comes to designing an alternate build from a set or sets, usually the first two choices that you make is whatever the thing you're trying to turn your set or sets into is, and then what set or sets you're going to use to do that. Once you choose whatever sets you're going to be using, you have immediately defined your design space. And what I mean by that is that your part geometry, the quantities of those parts, whatever those parts are, whether they be snot bricks, wedge plates, modified plates, hinges, turntables, connectors, tiles, all of these sorts of things have already been defined. So it takes a lot of the usual guesswork and freedom out of designing a normal MOC by giving you a bunch of fixed constraints in terms of what you can do. Generally, a good donor set to base an alt build on will give you a lot of options in terms of those types of pieces, not just a big pile of parts, but it will give you useful parts. Often these are parts that allow you to do interesting build technique or get angles. So your modified plates with clips, bars, hinges, snot bricks, brackets, a lot of these sorts of pieces are really what will give you a good set of parts to work for from an alt build. Of course, once you decide what sets you're going to be using, you need to decide what matters most for what you're going for. Of course, like most things, you can't optimize everything. And if you try to optimize everything, you're going to end up with a Swiss Army knife sort of build. Of course, a Swiss Army knife is great in the sense that it does a lot of different things, but it's a jack of all trades and a master of none. If you have a Swiss Army knife and it has a screwdriver and a knife and tweezers, these are all great to have on one tool, but none of these tools is generally better than that tool individually as its own dedicated thing. So really, you need to decide what features or aspects of your MOC that you're going to prioritize. If you want to have an accurate scale or form, for example, that's going to come at the cost of structure and play features and other factors of a MOC that you care about. So once you've made the decision about what sets you're going to use and what you're actually going to prioritize, everything else sort of makes sense in terms of the hierarchy of what features matter and what doesn't so much. Additionally, once you get to this stage, the main thing that makes an alt build interesting and what's really good, I think, as a designer for practicing these, even if you don't find the finished product to be that appealing, is that alt builds help you to stop thinking in terms of what the part was designed to do and start thinking in what the part can actually do. Once you have that limited constraint of I have these pieces and they only let me do these sorts of things in terms of what they do with the other pieces that I have, you stop thinking so much in terms of, in the original set, this was meant to be a leg, and you start thinking more in terms of outside of the original set. This allows me to get angles. So for example, if I want to have angled sides on my fighter tank, then I can use these pieces to achieve that. You don't only think in terms of function, but you start thinking in terms of appearance as well. Like for example, the Republic fighter tank that I built uses the 1x2 modified plates with the female ratcheting hinge on the long end to fill in some of the slopes on the front nose of the tank, because I just didn't have enough pieces to do that all tiled up and sloped off. But instead I looked at that piece and I said, okay, well, this is a small plate that also has this sort of rounded feature on the end, so I can use that to sort of accentuate and continue the sloped features where I don't actually have the pieces to do that in a conventional way. So it helps you see when you make an alt build that the same part can solve multiple different problems depending on how you decide to use it, and the constraints of making an alt build will force you to think in that way. So really, in terms of these things, you start building backwards instead of forwards with an alternate build. You think about the silhouette and the big picture and where you can afford to maybe cut some corners and where strength or function really is necessary for the build that you're making. Everything is a trade-off when you're doing an alt build because you're working in such a constrained space. So you really need to find the parts that serve the needs you're prioritizing first, even if that's not what they were designed for, and then kind of build everything else around what you have left. And I think this just goes to reinforce why set choice matters so much, because some sets are going to give you multiple ways to solve the same problem. Like for example, I think these walkers were really a great set to pick from because you have lots of different connectors that can do lots of different things. And there was a bunch of different ways that I could solve problems in terms of how I wanted to support the build and how I wanted to design certain parts of it, just because the pieces that I was given access to, even though there's not a lot of them, there was a lot of different connectors and a lot of things that allowed for interesting building techniques. Those are really the sets that are going to reward creativity and lead to better alternate builds, as opposed to sets that are mostly like bricks, plates, and tiles, for example, where you're really limited in terms of what you can do with that. You can certainly still get good things, but it's going to be a lot more difficult, and you're probably going to have to make a lot more sacrifices to get a good build out of a more limited set like that. So I think really when you're doing an alt build, whether it's good or not depends first on selecting the sets that you're going to use to make it, in terms of selecting sets that are going to give you enough pieces to achieve what you want, but not selecting so many different sets or so many quantities of sets that you don't really have to be creative creative. Then you need to have clear priorities about what you're actually designing towards. And then with the limited parts that you have, you need to get really creative about what you're actually doing. And of course, the most important part of that is that your parts aren't really the limiting factor in an alt build in terms of what you end up with, but unclear goals in every case will give you a bad alt build. So really, it's not so much about the parts in front of you, but about making something that's more than the sum of the parts in front of you.